Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Today we examine a Czech-Slovak meeting in Studénka, Czech Republic, where leaders Andrej Babiš and Robert Fico agreed a memorandum on cooperation in energy and transport, reflecting regional ties and shared priorities. Joining us is Jan Čulík. He's senior lecturer in Czech Studies at the University of Glasgow. Professor Čulík, welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening. Now, this is their first meeting in 3 years. What is the significance?
Now, I would say this meeting is and isn't ominous at the same time. Now, of course, they are saying, they published this official statement about the meeting, that it is a normal meeting between two very close countries, very close governments. It was actually a meeting of two governments together. And Babiš, after the meeting, said we really had to cut it short because we had so many things to discuss that actually various ministers couldn't even speak properly because there wasn't time. It is true that they also said that it was the 9th meeting between the Czech and the Slovak government. The first one was in 2012. And it's quite interesting that the previous meetings with the previous government of Petr Fiala, who was a kind of right-of-center, sort of typical pro-Western government, were not that frequent because there was a disagreement between the previous Fiala government, the Czech government, and the Fico-Slovak government about Ukraine, because the previous Czech government supported Ukraine against the Russian aggression, and Fico's position is slightly different. And actually, Babiš is kind of, if I may say so, slightly trying to sleaze up to Russia as well, even though he is trying not to say it quite publicly, because at the same time, he's an entrepreneur and he really needs the subsidies from the European Union. So they published this memorandum. They are saying that it's a very wide-ranging kind of memorandum of cooperation, foreign affairs, security, economy, energy, defense, education, culture, environment, and primarily they're saying that they were talking about energy problems. Babiš was trying to persuade Fico to stop his emergency sort of attitude about oil and gas, and also they agreed that there is some kind of large deposit of gas in Slovakia, and both the Czechs and the Slovaks are going to be tending it together. So that would actually feel like a sort of kind of normal agreement or meeting between two very close countries. People maybe don't know that, say, the Czech language and the Slovak language are incredibly close. When you speak Czech, you understand Slovak and vice versa. And also until the 90s, the Czech Republic and Slovakia was a single country. So there's a long kind of very close history. However, they are both oligarchs and authoritarians. So that's the ominous bit.
Right. Well, that's quite a complex mix that you've just described there. I'd like to focus on energy and Russian energy in particular, because of course Slovakia and Hungary are still getting their oil and gas from Russia, and they haven't weaned themselves off it. Are we saying that this new find of gas in Slovakia is actually going to move Slovakia away from Russia?
I don't, that wasn't actually discussed, but Fico was really complaining that apparently Ukraine is sort of boycotting the dispatches of oil and gas through the Ukraine. And of course, as your viewers probably know, Ukraine is saying the problem is that the Russians have actually damaged that oil pump pipeline. And Fico, of course, is saying this is all a lie, and it's just Ukraine is trying to really block us. And also there is one interesting point, if I may make a brief digression, it's quite interesting that Babiš is actually aligning himself with Fico so much, and Fico really mimics Orban. And it's basically this authoritarianism that is spreading through Central Europe. But it's interesting because Orban may lose the election in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. And why is Babiš kind of trying to sort of behave like Orban now, when Orban may be away in 3 weeks? Some people are saying that he's doing it because he's just starting his kind of government, and that if he behaves in an authoritarian way, people will get used to it, and towards the end of his government, people will just accept his authoritarian methods. It's very depressing in a way. So to go back to the energy. So Fico was complaining that the Ukrainians are blocking it. Babiš promised him that he will apparently send some experts to the Ukraine to check whether it's true that that oil pipeline is damaged or not. So they are apparently trying to cooperate quite closely about it. But I think, although again this wasn't said explicitly, that Babiš will just accept Russian oil and gas if he can, because he's that kind of person.
Okay, now what about the impact on the populations of these two countries? How will these agreements in the areas that you mention be received?
Well, it's quite interesting. Again, one thing is fairly sort of ambiguous. It's quite interesting that until fairly recently, in spite of Fico's hostile attitude towards Ukraine, actually Slovakia provided larger help to Ukraine than the Czech Republic under the previous pro-Western government, which was probably due to the incompetence of the previous Western government. But at the moment, well, now it's quite interesting. In the Czech Republic, Babiš and his populist oligarchical government won the election in the autumn because, I suppose, of the unpopularity of the previous pro-Western government, which basically was concentrated in Prague, and Prague is incredibly affluent, but actually there are places in the countryside which are really quite neglected, and people are quite poor. And so basically this is what happens when you have parts of the country which are poor. It destabilizes democracy, and then they vote for oligarchs. And there has been an opinion poll in the Czech Republic recently saying that about 35% of the population support Babiš, and about 35% of the population is against Babiš. So it's quite interesting that that basically the Czech population is kind of divided. And in Slovakia, it will be quite similar, although I was listening to a Slovak commentator, very well-known journalist, Arpad Šoltes, who actually escaped from Slovakia and now lives in the Czech Republic. And he was saying, well, look, Fico is an oligarch and is authoritarian, but he isn't actually a real brutal dictator. And he was very depressed. He spoke very depressingly, because he said, because he thinks that later on he will be replaced by somebody much more brutal in Slovakia as a dictator, because he said people want it. So I don't know whether he has these incredibly sort of negative views of his compatriots, the Slovaks, but it is true that in the countryside mostly, in both countries, there is kind of support for these oligarchs who ordinary people think will actually give them money and won't let them starve. So it is problematic.
Indeed, it sounds as though it is. Although the elections have been very close, haven't they?
Indeed, and that's why you've got this kind of division, sort of 6 months or whatever after the election, where quite a lot of people who voted for the previous Fiala government obviously hate Babiš, and then you've got lots of people. It's interesting. I do do stuff on the web, and I get these comments from the Czech Republic where some people are saying you're right to criticize Babiš, and then other people are saying you bastard, why are you criticizing Babiš? So obviously the population is divided.
Indeed. Now, just in the last couple of minutes that we have left, Jan, how is Hungary taking this? Because up until now, Slovakia and Hungary have been very much of a unified front. But Slovakia seems to be pulling itself away from Hungary. What do you read into that?
Well, there is this issue that, of course, Orbán may lose in a fortnight. And now it's quite interesting. Obviously, historically, the Czechs usually think that Slovaks are their closest brothers. But actually, a Slovak has recently explained to me that really the Slovaks are much closer to Hungarians, are following Hungarians more closely. There's a history from the 19th century when the Slovaks were under the Hungarians, and the Hungarians were sort of better people, more middle class than the Slovaks, so that apparently every Slovak aspires to be a Hungarian. But on the other hand, in Hungary, you've got this opposition now. And as we are saying, that Orbán may actually lose it in a fortnight. So maybe the Slovaks are now starting to watch it. And yet at the same time, this is really quite interesting that Babiš really is kind of pushing his oligarchical authoritarian rule. And he's very close to Orbán, actually. So God knows what kind of strategy this is. People maybe in the Czech Republic, some of them are afraid of what Babiš might do.
Yes, maybe they're trying to cover all the bases. Jan Čulík, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.